afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order, please. Good afternoon and welcome to this regular hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee. Today is Monday, October 21st, 2013. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee, and I'm joined by Councilmember Bob Blumenfield. We're going to go ahead and get started. As soon as the Controller arrives, we'll take him and his report out of order. The closed session item number 1 will be held at the end of our open session items. So we'll start first with the Controller's report, then we will go to the FSR, and consistent with our usual practices, the members will indicate which departments we have specific questions about. If we get to the, once we compile that list, if you're not on it, you're free to leave and go back to work. And then we'll proceed with the rest of the items, presumably in order. If we get another member, items 7 and 8, Mr. Blumenfield, I'm going to propose as consent items. But I'd like to do that when we have a quorum, so if you have no concerns about that when Mr. Kretz arrives, we'll be able to deal with those. So while we're waiting for the Controller, I'm going to go ahead and start taking public comment. We have one card on item number 2. No, I'm sorry, 2 cards on item number 2. So I'd like to call first Jim Mcquisten, followed by Dr. Molly Rhodes. Mr. Mcquisten, welcome.
Jim Mcquisten. As you see, I've put in a statement. It's got almost everything I wanted to say. One thing I do want to say, thank you to the CAO for not trying to renege on our promise to our city employees about the delayed raise. I think that's a very worthwhile thing to do, to go ahead with the promise, because I spend a lot of time down in the Figueroa Towers, and I noticed that people are kind of wondering whether or not they should work so hard because they don't know if they're going to get the shaft in January or not. But obviously the first FSR is going to more or less take that away, I believe. One thing, though, that I do want to emphasize in that statement is the fact that we're spending $20 million a year, which I've actually done the research, and that's a hard number where we shouldn't be. The law says we're not supposed to be doing that. And we can save that money, and as you can see, if there's estimated a $20 million shortfall right now, why that more or less erases the whole works. I don't think any of the shortfall that is listed here is going to be of consequence. But still, we should be, while we have the chance right now, we should be putting that into effect, because that is the law. It is in the LAMC. There's no reason not to do it. And just like when we found that there was $230 million spent that we didn't need to spend on trash pickup, we got after that, and now we did save that money. Now, $20 million is not $230 million, but every little bit helps. And what we're really needing is parks, recreation parks. $20 million can give us 2 of those parks.
Thank you. Dr. Rhodes.
Hi, thank you. I'm here for the Coalition of Unions as their research analyst, and of course also need to talk about the 5.5%. I appreciate the comments preceding me, but I'm a little less secure that the document says that our workers are getting the raise. I don't think that's what it says. But as you know, the city is legally obligated to pay that 5.5% beginning in January. Your trans document describes that raise, and it's existent perfectly. Quoting the trans, the agreement secured a 4% active employee contribution towards retiree health care, restructured cost of living adjustments, decreased salaries by 1.5%, and froze scheduled salary step increases for 1 year. In exchange, these employees were granted future salary increases, including a 5.5 increase on January 1st, 2004. The phrase "in exchange," I just want to highlight. There was a deal, and we made a sacrifice, and then we're supposed to get what we're due in January. So we expect that obligation will be lived up to. The trans also says what we saw during the budget hearings, that the money is parked for the raises in the UB and in special schedules and special funds. I wasn't clear going through all of the allocations in the FSR if there was any possibility that any of those funds were coming from any of those two items. So I'd appreciate it if you make that inquiry. And I just want to close saying that our members are still anxious about this issue. I was with a rep a few weeks ago while he took a call from a worker who was refinancing his house, and he needed to know whether he was getting his raise so that he could close his financing. So this is serious stuff. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. That completes the cards that I have on item number 2, but we haven't yet come to that item, so if anybody else would like to fill out a card on item number 2 or any other matter that's on the agenda or a general public comment card regarding anything within the jurisdiction of the committee, please fill out one of these cards and bring it up to our committee clerk. And with that, we will go to item number 4 out of order, as our City Controller, Ron Galperin, is here. Item number 4.
Item number 4 is the City Controller Report relative to the preliminary financial report on financial operations for the City of Los Angeles for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2013.
Mr. Galperin, welcome.
Good afternoon, and pleasure to be here again. And thank you so much, Mr. Chair and committee members. Today, I am presenting my first financial report as City Controller, and I think you've got copies of it in front of you, which is the City's preliminary financial report on financial operations for FY 2012 through 13. The report is a snapshot of how the City closed its budget, focusing on revenues and expenditures, reserves, and bonded indebtedness, mostly with a focus on the general fund. And while the economy and the City budget have shown some promising signs of improvement, I think the message from what it is that we found at closing is that the City really needs to continue to be very cautious going forward, and in many ways needs to change the way that it does business. General fund revenues and receipts for the fiscal year were $4.67 billion, which was about 2.6% in excess of the adopted budget. And notably, there were some additional revenues from property tax, documentary transfer tax, and transient occupancy tax that the City had in addition to what it had anticipated. That's good. And what we see, though, is that there is, for the adopted budget in the coming year, further expenditures, as I think you know. And when it comes to the reserves, thankfully, we saw some increase in that. Actually, we started the year at 6.7% as a net increase in those reserves, with a balance of about $326.7 million. But again, that 5%, which is the policy of the City in terms of reserve, is really a floor, not a ceiling. More is typically better, and wouldn't very much encourage that policy continue. I can talk about a few kind of guiding principles, as it were, that we can gather from these numbers. One is basically the importance of implementing a budget more based on performance and on measurable results, and obviously there's been a lot of talk here about doing so. We're working with Council and with the Mayor on that. And one of the things that I had spoken with the Chair about was to provide a summary of also all of the audit recommendations that have been done related to each and every department, so that when you go through the budget process, you'll have them all in one place in front of you to be able to look at what performance has been. I'm very much obsessed with return on investment and looking at how the money is getting spent and what are we getting in return for it, as it were. And we have an audit that we're beginning, for example, on Prop C and the expenditures relating to streets and how that is going. Reform of city procurement, process improvements, Workers' comp, actually, we're beginning a very deep look into workers' comp for police and fire, but in a way that I think hasn't been done before, actually looking at what are the exact types of injuries and what's the age distribution and how does that compare to other jurisdictions, et cetera. Very excited to say that we are about to launch a really revolutionary data portal, which is going to have information on all sorts of financials on the city, available 24 hours a day to everybody, and we've talked about that, and that is coming very soon. Special funds, that is. That is also another forthcoming report that we have talked about in this committee as well, really looking at those roughly 1,000 special funds, including about 500 special revenue funds. And in brief, things are a little bit better than were anticipated, but I would share the CAO's view on the need to be extremely cautious, and the economy is rather tenuous. So what revenues we do or do not see is yet to be determined by the future, obviously. So if you've got questions, I'm happy to answer. I also have Todd Bowie here from my office, and very much appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Blumenfield, any questions for the Controller? I appreciate many of the comments that you've made, and I think that this is a productive new direction that the Controller's Office is taking. A couple of things in particular that you mentioned. One is the workers' comp review, which is much needed, particularly in police and fire, but I think throughout the city. And I know that the City Attorney's Office is already beginning a comprehensive risk management analysis that will, largely include workers' comp as well as many other things. Are you having an opportunity to interface with the City Attorney's Office in doing that so that we're not duplicating that effort, and has that been a positive collaboration?
Absolutely. Yes to all the questions that you just posed. And I personally have a standing meeting with the city attorney on a regular basis. Also, our staffs are cooperating on a variety of issues, including notably everything having to do with risk mitigation and workers' comp. So look forward to continuing to actually partner with him and with his office on this.
Great. With regard to the special fund report,
yes.
This committee and the Controller's Office have been working on sort of parallel tracks in that regard. When do you anticipate you'll be able to report comprehensively about the special funds, and particularly whether or not they've been appropriately accounted with regard to reimbursements to the general fund?
Very important question. First of all, I wanted to thank also the CAO for the work that they have been doing on this. And what we have done, and I'll ask Todd to comment on this a little bit, was sending out correspondence to all the various departments, offices of the city, so that we could get them to actually validate the numbers that we have before we put them out. So do you want to comment on that?
Sure. We've gone through an extensive outreach process with departments and in conjunction with the City Administrator's Office. As you know, the departments are ultimately the owners and responsible for the management of the special funds, and so a lot of the information resides with them. So we have gone about the process of collecting an extensive amount of information about the various special funds in terms of how they're used, what are their kind of origins in terms of ordinances, and so a lot of information to help us understand what all these funds are doing, as well as mining out and being able to present the balances of these funds comprehensively for each fund in the city. We also, so that information is basically being finalized as we speak. So in this coming month, we should be able to bring forward reporting in order to demonstrate where these funds are, what their purposes are, and we will have some findings in terms of accounting of these funds, I believe. However, I think the $40 million question probably that you're asking there in terms of reimbursements to the funds, I think that's going to be an even more extensive process probably than what we've been able to do to this point.
Well, and just so that I'm clear on that, it seems like the vast majority of these funds are residuals from something that's already been, finished a long time ago. There's a lot of them that are very small potatoes, probably not that consequential. So when we talk about the hundreds of special funds, most of them are very small amounts of money. What I would like to see, and I think what we've discussed with the CAO and what I'd like, if we can, in coordination with your office, is to identify what are the highest risk areas where we have a significant amount of money that is most likely to produce results if we audit those to determine that reimbursement has been appropriate. And so I would first like to see kind of a triage and say these are the areas that we think deserve immediate attention, and then we can save the lion's share of it for when when we're done with that part.
That's absolutely correct, because it's really not possible, truth be told, to dive into each and every one of them, nor would it be particularly useful or the best use of everybody's time. But by doing this first step, what we're able to do is identify those that have the greatest potential, those that really need to be looked into with much greater depth.
Okay. Anything further, Mr. Blumenfield?
No, I really appreciate the controller's hard work on this and good work on this, and we're going to continue to pursue this avenue and work with you in any way we can. And I guess I'll throw that out too, if there's things that you think we need to be as a council to help support better auditing and of this information, keep us apprised of that.
Right. I definitely intend to take you up on that. So thank you very, very much.
Well, it is a good point, and we're going to note and file this report today without objection. But if there are specific policy recommendations consistent with the general strategy that you've laid out that you want to recommend, needless to say, they're always welcome, and you're welcome to come back either here or to any of us individually, but we certainly welcome your recommendations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then we will proceed next to the FSR, item number 2.
Item number 2 is a City Administrative Officer report relative to the first financial status report for fiscal year 2013-14.
Mr. Santana, welcome. We've already taken public comment on this matter. Is there anybody else that wanted to offer public comment on item number 2? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Santana.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So this is our first FSR for the fiscal year, and as we indicated at the conclusion of the budget process last fiscal year, this budget really demonstrates a turning point in the city's finances from the last 4 years, from crisis management to a more proactive strategic management kind of program. It's good to report that we have a budget stabilization fund of $69.5 million and a reserve fund of $326 million, or 6.71% of the general fund. As I agree with the controller's comments that the policy for a 5% reserve fund is simply a floor, not a ceiling, and having a healthy reserve fund is certainly an essential part of our overall fiscal health. We continue to, unfortunately, show out shortfalls in the future. We haven't made any adjustments to our projections that were made in the last fiscal year. Currently, they range for next fiscal year between $153 million to $242 million, based on a number of scenarios, including the 5.5% salary adjustment that was mentioned earlier in public comment. The city is certainly, while we're making progress, we're certainly not without risk ahead of us. A recent Moody's publication yet emphasized again the importance of maintaining control of our pension costs, and we have a separate report on that issue. We have litigation that's outstanding and some that are reaching closure that bring greater concern specifically around retiree health care. And we also are uncertain as to the future of the national economy, particularly in light of what we saw in Washington just a few weeks ago. As part of the forecast, we do have the assumption that we will be able to proceed forward the next fiscal year without any increases among all bargaining units. And we are entering this year beginning those negotiations with most of the bargaining units. In terms of how the city is doing so far, we've identified about a $25.3 million deficit for the first fiscal year. It's driven by four principal areas. First, in the fire department, due to decisions made by your council, among other issues in regarding to ambulance, enhancing the ambulance program, error found in the police department of $3.8 million, a city attorney of $2 million, and the new public health initiative of $4.6 million. That's the cost of putting that item on the ballot. We're hoping to find, working with the city attorney, a solution that we think DOT will be able to address a small deficit, about $800,000, $88 million internally through grant reimbursements. In terms of revenue, it's always too early to be able to identify revenue at this time in terms of the year end. These are initial receipts. I think the controller gave a good summary of our revenue, so we're not recommending any major changes in revenue at this time. With that, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Blumenfield, any general questions first, and then we'll go ahead and identify what department-specific issues we'd like to talk about.
Okay, well, just on the general, just to clarify, the structural versus the one-time, yes, you said the projected between 153 to 200 shortfall. Is that all structural?
Yes.
Okay, and so the one-time is the litigation risks and the other things on top of that?
There are several issues that we highlight in our report in terms of litigation that, should they not result in a favorable outcome for the city, would be a one-time hit. But if they change existing policy, for example, our program around retiree health care or other areas that are central to the overall well-being of the city's finances, then there would be an ongoing problem. But the deficit range for fiscal year 14-15 is based on a number of scenarios that impact wages, our pension assumptions, as well as how we treat police overtime, which will have to be changed at the end of this fiscal year due to the bargaining agreement expiring. So, but that is an identification of the structural deficit. To put it in context, when we issue these numbers, having been here now for over 4 years, we look at these numbers and think, wow, they're so much less than what we had originally projected. They're still significant, but they're certainly more manageable than what we had projected just a few years ago.
And I guess the other generic question along the same lines is, you have a large, or not a large comparatively speaking, but let's say growing debt for the structural debt for the year. The quicker we can handle some of those things, the less painful it will be, because the overall amount of impact you'll have to make will be less, because you're not giving it a chance to keep growing throughout the year. Are there certain fixes that if we did them quickly could save us pain down the road in terms of the end of the year? Are there things that you want to highlight timing-wise that would make more fiscal sense to act on sooner than later in the year?
So, as I talked about, the $25 million deficit we currently are facing for this fiscal year, some of those things we can't control. We can't control having to place the public health initiative on the ballot. That's a one-time hit of 4.6. The error in the police department accounting is an error. There's not much that could be done, and the others are fairly small. The one policy decision that could be made is regarding to the unfunded ambulance augmentation plan that was adopted the last fiscal year. That's a cost of about $333 million a month. That's $833,000 a month. And then there's also the implementation of the changes within the fire dispatch center of about $333,000 a month. So combined, they're well over $1 million a month The second issue is a little more challenging. We've been meeting with UFLAC on the change of how the dispatch center is managed to address litigation that occurred around the use of overtime in FLSA. But the specific issue on the ambulance augmentation plan, that's a policy decision that the council made that could certainly be addressed either by funding it fully or by ending that program.
And we'll discuss that at greater length with the fire department shortly. You talked about the numbers here being significantly smaller than what they were. Just if you can put that into a context, can you compare where we stand now with where we were projected to be standing 4 years ago for this fiscal year?
Well, 4 years ago, or just not even 4 years ago, I would say about 2 to 3 years ago, we had projected that the shortfall for the current fiscal year would have been well over $1 billion, and that was significantly reduced to just above, close to between $200 and $300 million. What we're seeing, even under the worst case scenario that we've laid out in terms of wages, in terms of the use of overtime, for the next 4 years, we could actually see a light at the end of the tunnel where we no longer have a structural deficit. You know, this is assuming that revenues continue to grow at 3.5% or so. It assumes that we maintain our workforce at the current level. It assumes that we're not increasing compensation for a period of years. Our pension costs, while we continue to grow, are growing at a lesser pace than what we had originally projected. So that's critical to that is the full implementation of the new civilian pension tier. So under one scenario, we actually see a surplus in 4 years. In another scenario, we eliminate the structural deficit after several years. So just 2 years ago, we didn't imagine being in a place where we didn't have a structural deficit. And of course, this is all under the assumption that there isn't a new revenue stream that comes in. You know, we made that attempt almost a year ago unsuccessfully. So the challenge that the city is facing is that while we have made significant progress in those areas, there are external factors that we can't control that impact our forecast. So another recession, which certainly the city has a role, but obviously most of that takes place outside of the city and within the global economy. You know, I was asked by reporters what's the impact of the potential government shutdown at the federal level, and you know, while it did impact some reimbursements and you know, in some programs, ultimately the biggest impact was on the economy, and certainly if we had seen a major fluctuation or drop in the overall stock market, the impact would be on both on our revenue for the long term, but obviously on our pension systems as well. So there's uncertainty that exists that, as the controller indicated, requires us to maintain a cautious approach and still be very careful in how we proceed in the future.
What was the last time we had a reserve fund at or above 6.5%?
That would be never.
All right. Thank you very much. Don't go anyplace. What we're going to do next is review our list of departments so we can get most of these folks out of here and back to work. And by the way, I should just say generally, this is one of the easier looking FSRs that we've had in a while. And I think we're going to have a lot fewer questions than we typically would just because of the significant progress that collectively this city has made in remedying its budget challenges. And it's really a tribute to all of the departments that are represented here in this room, as well as your office and the CLA, this committee, and the mayor's office, and you know our partners in organized labor as well, that we've been able to take really dramatic steps forward, I think, in remedying what seemed to be an unremediable problem just a few short years ago, and it doesn't seem that way anymore. So congratulations to you and your office, Mr. Santana, and to everybody here who's made that possible.
And thank you for us new members coming in and making life a little easier.
Well, and of course, it's important to put it into this context so that, I mean, you experienced a similar experience in Sacramento, but I hope that all of our new members also appreciate that it's not always as easy as this one would make it appear, and it hasn't been just a short time ago. All right, Mr. Blumenfield, what departments would you like to call out for questions?
Several quick, small questions, but for City Clerk, you mentioned fire, ITA, GSD, library, planning.
Oh, slow down. I got to take notes. Okay, so start from the top again.
City Clerk,
Yeah.
you mentioned fire. We've already talked about it. I imagine we'll probably do that. ITA,
Okay.
GSD, library, planning, engineering, and sanitation.
Okay. Okay, so then we'll ask the following departments to stay. I'm going to combine Mr. Blumenfield's and mine, and everybody else can go. The City Attorney.
Yep.
City Clerk. Ethics. Fire. General Services. ITA, library, planning, police, Bureau of Engineering, and Bureau of Sanitation. Wait. Don't leap up yet. Wait for it. Yes, and that's it. So if you're not among those mentioned, thank you very much for coming down. Thank you for your continuing work on our budget, and have a good day.
A reverse lottery.
All right. Let's start with City Attorney. Who's here with the City Attorney's office? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Blumenfield, go right ahead.
Well, I don't know if City Attorney, but there's a lot of lawsuits out there. Is there a way to give us a sense of which ones might be settled this year in terms of timing and the overall?
You know, we didn't prepare that information for the committee today, but we'd be happy to come back with a separate report.
Okay, because that could certainly help us imagine the world of the budget possibilities in terms of not necessarily even the probabilities, but just the sense that these are even off the table for this year.
The liability account, though, is projected to come in well within budget, though, this year still. Is that correct?
Sir, it is kind of early in the year, but to the best of our knowledge, it is at this point. The office is preparing a report for both the outside counsel and the liability claims account that would address both these questions.
Okay.
That should be coming in the next couple of weeks or so.
Great.
I know we've been working with your office to try to provide some technology upgrades, which are very sorely needed and which will more than pay for themselves, I'm confident. But I think where we stand is we're still waiting for a specific plan, technology plan from your office. Is that right?
That is correct. We're working with the ITA just so that we can get what we can within the funding that is provided for us. So that also is work in progress at this point.
Okay. And likewise, the office is still very understaffed in my view, but you're currently working on a hiring plan to lay the groundwork for restoration for some of those positions, as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, the managed hiring plan was recently approved. We plan to move forward quickly, and also with the ITA piece, we plan to submit a plan very quickly.
Okay. Anything else? Nope. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to City Clerk. All right, Mr. Bloomfield.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. This is about the $4.6 million for the public health initiative and the timing of that. The city attorney is seeking the determination, and the question is, when do you think we'll know the answer on that, and is there going to be enough time to put the brakes on this, or could we end up in a situation where the city attorney, where they end up ruling in our favor, but we still end up having to outlay all this money because of the timing?
Holly Walcott, interim city clerk. We have until January. Then we would start incurring costs.
Okay. And do we have an indication that we'll have an answer by then?
I'd have to defer to the city attorney on that, but I would assume so. I mean, they're diligently working with the county to resolve it in time. I mean, they're aware of the deadlines.
And then if we hit January, is it all or nothing, or does it scale? I mean,
Scale. Yeah. We would start incurring costs as city clerk because we have to start putting together printing. That's what's the first.
We start incurring, and is it? I don't know. You can't imagine what the curve would be, but I mean, is it a
Well, the city's
even slope, or is it we're going to spend it all out right away?
I'm not quite sure. I know the city's portion of the 4.6 is $800,000, and we wouldn't generally pay the county until after the election. So I can get back to you on that, but I don't have a great
Didn't
answer.
expect you to necessarily have the exact answer. I was just sort of raising the issue and wanted to know. Thank you.
It's a very significant issue that people need to be aware of, that the mere fact of this initiative is going to, pass it or not pass it, is going to cost the city over $4 million that could otherwise be used for city services. I'm not going to make any editorial comments about that right now, but it is important for people to understand that this is utterly without the city's control, and when these things go on the ballot, particularly when it has to be a special election, it's going to cost $4 million to the city just to put it on the ballot. And along those lines, there's another initiative that I understand is
It's in circulation right now.
It is in circulation on medical marijuana.
Right. It has not come back in, so we wouldn't start incurring costs on that until it actually was submitted back.
When it does come in, you're estimating it's going to cost nearly $100,000 just to count the signatures and verify
Correct.
them. And if that were to qualify, would it require an augmentation similar to the healthcare initiative to put it on the ballot? What ballot would it go on, I guess, is the first question.
It would depend on when it came in. It would go on the next available regularly scheduled election. So if it came in time, it could still make, if it came in by January, it could still make the June ballot. Or if it came in the spring, it would make the November ballot. it's always the first initiative that costs the most. So the first initiative costs $4.6 million, and then it's gradual after that, and it's mostly just the printing costs after that. So it would be probably about $1 million for every initiative. Every additional initiative. So, and that would be for June. We don't have costs from the county yet for November, but it's always prorated based on the number of entities that are participating in the election.
All right. Great. Anything else? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us next to ethics. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Blumenfield, anything on ethics? This week, we're going to be considering some recommendations that you've made on revamping the ethics ordinance and also considering a motion relating to encouraging greater participation in our elections. I know it's early to tell, and it probably hasn't even been analyzed yet by either your office or the CAO, but would you expect that if those two measures advance, that will require additional funding for your department?
Good afternoon. Heather Holt for the Ethics Commission. Yes, is the short answer with both of those proposals. We understand that one of the things that the City Council is interested in doing with regard to the governmental ethics ordinance would require a citywide database of contractors and bidders, and that would require staffing and technology support for us in order for us to be able to comply with that requirement. So there's a cost associated with that. You're right that we have not yet gotten to a detailed analysis of what that dollar figure might be. But in addition, there will probably also be some costs associated with changes to the election schedule, just in terms of the matching funds program and different requirements that we have in getting through an election.
Okay. None of those assumptions have been considered as far as this analysis yet. It's too early to say.
That's right. None of that is incorporated into this FSR.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay. That brings up the fire department. Thank you very much. Chief Cummings, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Mr. Bloomfield, do you want to start off?
Well, it's more broad in terms of, we've instructed the department to enact the ambulance program and to do the things we started talking about. And so the question is, what's the plan for making the department whole? And I guess that's both for you and for CAO.
Well, the department's standing by. We staff the ambulances. We transition staffing from our light force companies to those 11 ambulances, and that's our staffing. At the council's request, we continue to staff those unfunded positions, and we'll do so until the council directs us to stop staffing them. So it is to stop the $900,000 per month, $833,000 per month. We just need the direction from the council, and we'll go ahead and stop staffing those positions.
Your sense that those positions are needed?
It's a complicated answer. We need those ambulances. 6-person staffing on those light forces allows us to do more than 5-person staffing. And there's very few incidents where getting more people there quicker is not going to have a better result. Can we operate with the 5-person staffing on those light forces temporarily? Absolutely we can. And we'll be coming forward in the next fiscal year requesting to restore some of those positions, and over the next 3 years we're going to ask to have them all restored, all 22 positions restored. But for right now, within the budget that we have, the best way that we can operate is with those ambulances that we need for the emergency medical service call, and then we make sure that we're operating safely with those 5-member light forces.
What's the status of the AB 678 reimbursements? We've been eager to get that money now for a long time, and it seems to be right around the corner all the time.
Absolutely.
Why is that, and what can we do about it?
Well, the CMS finally did approve. I feel like I'm talking so loud. CMS finally did approve the cost methodology. That's the good news. The bad news is that based upon the formula that was approved, it was obviously contrary to what we had proposed. The methodology that we proposed would have allowed us to receive revenues approximately $30 to $33 million. Unfortunately, because of the change in the cost formula, based on staff's calculation, we are estimating that we're going to be receiving $18 million instead. In terms of the timing of receipt of that, the timelines that were established by the state is that approximately $12 million will be received around February of 2014, and approximately $6 million will be received around April of 2014.
Okay. So it's disappointing that we're getting about half of what we had planned to get, losing $1.5 million a month, basically. Is there any further recourse that we can take with regard to the difference in definitions that we can continue to pursue, or is that completely a closed issue now?
It's a closed issue. That's a determination that's made by the federal government, and it's our understanding that the formula that was developed was based upon their continued discussions with legal counsel within the federal government, and they needed to ensure that the program was in compliance with their regulations, and that's how we ended up with what we have.
On a go-forward basis, Councilmember Corcoran, they are looking at the piece that was taken out is the part of the emergency medical service response that's on the fire engines. We respond paramedics and EMTs on the fire engines. They are looking at going back to CMS and including that on a go-forward basis in the calculations. They thought it would require a legislative change, but right now what we're hearing is that in review of the actual language that was in AB 678, it already includes that suppression component. So they're pursuing that on a go-forward basis as part of the reimbursement. Again, they're just starting down that path. The California Fire Service, CPF, is pushing it forward, and we're hoping to get that piece of it as well.
Okay. My recollection, this has been a while since we looked at this here, but my recollection there was the one-time reimbursement for all the prior charges, and then there was a going-forward projection that we had. So does the analysis that you just described apply to that going-forward component? So,
yes.
So hopefully we would...
That's what they're looking at. That's what, and again, I can understand June's skepticism.
You don't seem to have much hope.
I was just up in Sacramento with the California Chiefs Officers Association, and they feel fairly confident that on a go-forward basis that they'll be able to get that suppression component, especially because so much of the California Fire Service has their emergency medical service on that suppression component, on their fire engines, on their fire trucks. The state understands it. They believe that CMS understands it. It's just getting the methodology down so that they can put that in.
And I'm sorry, Councilman, I was trying to understand your question. I had the impression that your question related to a retroactive payment. Was that your question?
No, I think it's clear that as to the retroactive payment,
no, that's done.
That's done.
Right.
I'm just wondering on the going forward component.
And that's what we're looking at, is the moving forward
to expand that.
Yes, continue building.
Is there a CMS appeals in any way?
No.
Doesn't seem so.
I've seen that in other areas. Some of the health and human service stuff, I've seen CMS, the state appeal their rulings and sometimes be successful, but maybe in this case there's not.
I don't want the tail to wag the dog here too much because this is small in the big scheme of things, but as we move forward with new deployment plans, as we move forward with a 5-year plan for service restoration, will the model that we use in that deployment plan impact the degree to which we'll be able to qualify within that formula? In other words, will it increase or decrease the amount of fire suppression component, I guess,
There'll be an increase in both portions. As we look at building the fire department towards that emergency medical service need that we have, there'll be an increase in the number of ambulances that we have, but there'll also be an increase of the number of paramedics that are responding on suppression resources as well. So we'll be increasing in both categories. So if the suppression piece does come in, there'll be an increase in that, and then as well as the transport piece of it.
And then with regard to dispatch, and obviously I think everybody has been frustrated with, the length of time that this has gone on. What's the outlook now from your perspective? Do we have any sense of when we can expect some closure on this? Because this is constant bleeding that's it's adding up, obviously.
Yeah, the parties have finally declared impasse. So the next step is for that recommendation to go to EERC, and then the next step will be the fact-finding process. And usually the fact-finding process takes approximately 6 months. And my understanding is that typically UFLAC requires that the process intermediation before it goes to the fact-finder.
So maybe this is best directed to you, Mr. Santana. I would guess then, given that time frame, it seems unlikely that we're going to have a change in this prior to the end of the fiscal year.
I think that's a fair assumption.
So maybe we need to change our budget assumption with regard to this for this fiscal year.
And just to put this in context, there'll be most likely another FSR before the calendar year is out. So we'll look at this and any other sort of transactional changes at that time.
Okay. Speaking of the fiscal year, June, you mentioned anticipated February and April receipt date for the AB 678 money. I've heard previously dates when we expect to get the money. What's our level of confidence that we'll be receiving that $18 million during this fiscal year before June 30th?
Well, previously the information provided was not memorialized. The dates that were provided to us were memorialized by the state. They indicated that, well, let me back up a bit. The deadline for submitting the cost reports is December for the first payment, and February for the second payment. And they indicated that payment should be received by the provider agencies 60 days after that. So that's, on that basis, we're relying on the February and April date.
Okay. So at least we have confirmation from another government entity of the dates that we're going to be receiving it, but we're still at the mercy of another governmental entity. So, okay. Anything else, Mr. Bloomfield? No?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good. Okay, that brings us to ITA? No, General Services. Okay.
Good afternoon. Victor Yee, Department of General Services.
Good afternoon. Mr. Bloomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. Have we budgeted for the fluctuations in petroleum and compressed natural gas and diesel, et cetera? It's been changing a lot. How are we budgeting?
Angela Sherrick-Bright, Assistant General Manager, Department of General Services. Yes, we have budgeted for the fluctuations. Generally, we add about 5% per year for petroleum fluctuations, and we did that for this coming fiscal year.
Okay. And obviously, prices have been going down, so hopefully that's
a good
giving
thing.
you a nice cushion. So, okay. The new vehicle management system to track the fleet, it's in the implementation phase, and as I understand it, we're talking about a vendor solution, potentially, as opposed to doing it in-house. And LAPD is not sure that the vendor is going to work for them. Do we have what's the update on that, and how are we going to deal with that if it doesn't work for them?
We've been working with the departments, so it's GSD, Fire Department, Police Department, and ITA. We've been working with the vendor to look at system requirements and also security requirements. So right now, we actually have a systems requirement meeting for LAPD that's scheduled for November 6th. At that point, LAPD will be able to make a determination as to whether or not the vendor will be able to meet their security requirements. Once we find that out, we'll be able to make a better determination of how to go forward. The vendor has suggested that they can give LAPD a separate environment which would actually meet their security requirements, but that is a question that LAPD will have to answer at this point.
Okay. And then also a question about where are we in the process of replacing vehicles to comply with the various vehicle emission mandates?
Based on the current budget that the council and mayor approved, we're still a bit behind schedule because in previous years we haven't been able to keep up because of budget constraints. So this current year, what you have before you in the financial status report is about $25.8 million to replace vehicles, and that will help us meet CARB requirements. So that's the California Air Resources Board. What the Resources Board does is look at the fleet as a whole, and they determine whether or not we're under the emission standards. And so by replacing the vehicles that are in the FSR, we'll be able to meet those standards.
Okay, so we are budgeted to meet those standards and we're on track for that?
At this point in time, we're budgeted, but of course, for the next fiscal year, we'll be asking for additional funds because we are behind. If the report shows that we were actually suspended in purchasing back in 2009. So we're kind of behind the eight ball, and we're playing catch-up at this point. And so this current fiscal year, we'll be able to do the replacement of about, like I said, $25 million. And that will keep us on track. But we'll need to ask for additional funds each fiscal year to actually catch up and to stay on track with both CARB and AQMD.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Blumenfield actually anticipated my question with regard to vehicles, but I wasn't sure that I quite understood. We've budgeted the 25.8 in MCLA financing for the replacement vehicles. Do you anticipate that the implementation of that replacement will be completed within the fiscal year? Will those vehicles, in fact, be purchased within the year?
It will take probably about, I'd say, 18 months to get all of the vehicles, because remember, they have to actually be manufactured. We have to go out to bid, so the city uses the bid process. And generally, if we're not buying anything off the shelf, if we can't use a cooperative agreement, we'll actually have to go out to bid, and in that case, the vehicles will actually have to be manufactured. So we may not be able to purchase everything within this fiscal year. However, with the projections and estimates that we've made based on CARB's rules, we anticipate that we will be in compliance.
Okay. It looks like a lot of them are almost off the shelf. If not, you have sedans and light-duty and medium-duty trucks. I'm sure they're going to have to be customized for our purposes, but those could probably be purchased more quickly, I assume, than
sweepers and pavers and profilers. That's correct.
So as those new vehicles are, this is very small potatoes, forgive me, but just for context, since we're going to be in greater emissions compliance, I assume that also entails an increase in fuel efficiency on the part of these vehicles. Usually they go hand in hand, not always, but I'm assuming that we'll have greater miles per gallon or reduced fuel costs, I should say, whether it's gas or CNG, as these are implemented.
Well, keep in mind the city was way ahead, way out front with respects to purchasing hybrid vehicles. So we may have already seen the efficiencies that we're going to see with respects to the fuel pricing. So if we're actually looking for savings, we might not see those because we were ahead of the eight ball a long time ago. We were, we bought hybrid vehicles way before other cities did, and because of that, we've been very efficient. And so our replacements at this point will be other hybrids. So we may not see a lot of savings with respects to fuel costs. We are in the process of converting our diesel fleet, the refuse vehicles, to liquefied natural gas, and we're in the process of converting our sweeper fleet to compressed natural gas. So we may see some emission savings there, not necessarily cost savings.
Okay, great. And just to follow up on the fuel cost issue, this is a question I think I ask every year, because it will come up on an ongoing basis, I'm sure. Is it possible? I mean, one analysis that I've tried to make of this is how do our projections of fuel costs compared to national standards of projections of fuel costs, since it's a global marketplace for fuel. I'm going to kind of tack away from that a little bit and just ask if we could, and maybe, Mr. Santana, you already have this at your fingertips, I don't know, but what I'd like to see is, say for the last 5 years, what has our budgeted fuel cost projection been, and then how has that compared to our actual fuel cost expenditure? And the value of that will be because this is such a wildly fluctuating area of the budget, I think it will help members to get a sense of the predictability of that number and what our margin of error should be, basically. So
we could submit a separate report on that.
Thank you. All right. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Control what happens in the Middle East, we'll be fine, right?
And that brings us next to ITA.
Hello.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir?
Mr. Blumenfield.
Sure, thank you. The aging IT infrastructure, it's out of date for security protections. That's going to need to be addressed in the upcoming fiscal year. What's our long-term plan and anticipated need to accomplish those upgrades?
Are you talking in particular about the workstations or overall the city's infrastructure?
Overall.
I'm sure you'll see some budget packages from ITA with requests related to infrastructure, both in terms of communications, public safety, and technology.
Okay, anything more specific than that in terms of today that you want to mention, or just you're saying we'll see that in the future?
The ITA is doing what we can with our budget. We have funding for some basic network component replacements, but overall these are going to be long-term and expensive projects, and likely things that may require staffing outside of ITA's current resources, which are really just sort of day-to-day operations.
Okay. In terms of the security issue?
We are making great progress in hiring a CISO, so we expect that certainly by the end of the month we'll have a candidate, and that we are looking forward to having that person come up with some policies and working with other city departments, particularly Lawa Harbor and DWP, that are a little more advanced than the rest of the city in security policies, to develop something that we can enforce citywide.
It's very important that we do that, obviously, and I'm worried about the liability costs that are hidden on that, or maybe not they're hidden in plain sight. We know that there's going to, if we're not secure, the potential cost that could inflict on us.
And I know Steve has addressed at ITGS the basic network things that we're doing to reinforce our infrastructure with the funding that we have right now. And so there's certainly progress that we're making on securing our websites and our infrastructure.
Absolutely. You guys have been very methodical about it and bringing it forward in every ITGS meeting. We talk about that on your list of priorities, so I know it's a big one, and I just wanted to highlight it for these hearings.
If I could add to that, in terms of the bigger picture on IT infrastructure, the mayor and the council did put aside about $300,000 for a strategic advisor to help the department, as well as my office and the CLA, develop a long-term strategic plan around information technology in the city. And so that's well on its way to lay out sort of both a short-term and a long-term plan for how we want to manage information technology through the next several years.
It's just one of those areas where we put a little bit of money in, and up front we can save a lot of money across the city in a variety of different ways as we sort of modernize. And so I'm looking forward to working with you on that.
Thank you. Yeah, we do really believe that there's an ROI that we can demonstrate when we propose the budget packages this year.
I think there unquestionably is, and the converse is also true, that as we've made cuts in ITA, there's a multiplier effect from those cuts. And Mr. Blumenfield, I'm very encouraged that you're our new chair of the policy committee, because I know you'll bring a lot of innovative thinking to to our technology infrastructure. But one of the challenges that we've had, frankly, is that there are public constituencies for just about every area of our budget. And so when we go through the budget process, when it comes time to cut budgets, those constituencies will stand up in council and defend their turf, as they should. The problem is, nobody gets that passionate about whether or not the city has new computers. And the result is that when we don't, every other department in this city suffers. And so I'm glad you're there. Thank you very much for your work. And I have just one question, actually. The salaries account is showing a projected deficit that's apparently going to be made up if grant reimbursement comes in. But I guess I want to have a sense of our degree of certainty that those reimbursements will, in fact, come in within the fiscal year.
Yes, we're certain that we will be reimbursed eventually by the UASI program.
Eventually, but will it happen by June 30th?
Probably not. We have not historically been reimbursed by that point. I think there's just a delay because it's on a pure reimbursement basis, and by the time the mayor's office is able to aggregate all of the costs and submit for reimbursement, it does come in beyond the end of the year.
Okay, so that's a
deficit
that we're
normal
likely,
process, yes.
It's a deficit that we're likely going to have to address and eat this fiscal year, it sounds like, Mr. Santana. Yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the library. Good afternoon. Mr. Bloomfield.
Yeah, on library issues, we're projecting a $3.4 million year-end surplus, which in tough budget times we generally want to say, all right, great, we're getting surplus, that's more money for the city. But I worry about it in departments that are so directly linked to services to the constituents. And libraries is right up there with street services and Bureau of Engineering and those kinds of things. Because my constituents in the West Valley, they really use the library quite a bit, and it's a great resource. So what do we do to help you spend that money in the right way so that we're maximizing the service, or do you feel like we have hit that maximization point? What else can be done so that we are actually spending that money on the services for the constituents?
Kyle Milliger, business manager for the library department. As of the end of September 2013, we had 100 budgeted vacant positions. We've recently received authority. 32 of those positions are directly associated with the increase in service hours coming in January 2014. We recently received managed hiring approval. October 18th was the last date that we received approval for 49 positions. We're currently in the process of hiring those 49 positions. They're in various stages of the interview and certification process. We have been augmenting our staff vacancies with as needed, and we have not, reneged on our ability to provide services to the public. So we remain open at our libraries and providing public service to the libraries.
How has the response been to your efforts to fill those positions? Is there a significant pool of applicants? Or are you having trouble filling up?
30 of those positions that we recently received authority to hire are librarians. So they're very specialized positions. So our recruitment efforts over the last few years have been curtailed a bit. Not as many people are going to library school. But we do have a current list now in place. It was just certified in the last few months. So we do have an actual list, eligible list to cert from.
Can you tell us how many names you have on the list? Is it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I do not know.
Well in excess, though, of the 40 or so that you're, or 32 that you're filling?
Yes, I do believe that we have sufficient on that list to be able to hire.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. That brings us to planning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, council members. Yvonne McDaniel, Planning Department.
This one's up to you.
So, thank you. The planning projects a shortfall of about $915,000 for vacancies in grant-funded positions. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the grant-funded positions, are we losing revenue there? Is that revenue lost forever, or is that grant money that we can make up?
We can make it up because the reason we're losing grant fund money was because we estimate so much reimbursement in this year, and our vacancies have not been filled, and we're gradually filling it, but the work is moving forward. We're signing a contract with the Metro for the round 3 of the TOD grant work program, and that is moving forward, and we will be able to kicking off the program very soon.
Just from a layperson's perspective, you think, okay, if you don't have someone there to write the grant or to manage the grant, and you lose on that round, and okay, you can apply the next round, but how do you make up for
Metro
you didn't apply for?
I'm sorry. Metro understands the process takes time in the city in order to get the positions filled, first authorized then filled. So we have not. Metro is giving us some extension. So the program year is, I think round 3 is a 3-year program. So the 3-year will not kick off until the contract is signed. So even though we thought we would be able to kick off by July 1st, now we have a somewhat extension from Metro. We will be able to still have the full 3-year program. So the reimbursement will be based on the program years, not the city's fiscal year.
Okay, so my concerns are misplaced. We're not losing any money because of lack of grant positions.
Keeping my fingers crossed, we'll get those positions filled very soon. We will not lose any grant money.
Okay, that's good, because I hate to see grant money. We can all agree we don't want to leave money on the table that's out there.
Totally agree.
Also, wanted to ask about the status of the Valley community plans and updates. So just as a Valley rep, I'm interested in that.
I'm sorry, I do not have the details that I may be answer your question exactly, but the 2 Valley plans are moving forward. One is Selmar, and the other one is Granada Hills. We still have some work to do. One of the things I believe is the equine issue that we're trying to address in the community plan, and the other thing was we still have the EIR that we need to continue working and wrap up. But those 2 plans are moving forward, and we're hoping to be I think they already went through the CPC. We should be able to work on the schedule for the plum review very soon. But if council prefers, we can provide a more detailed report to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings up police. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Bloom, well, first, if you could identify yourselves.
Oh, Laura Luna, Command Officer, Fiscal Operations, LAPD.
And Anne Marie Sauer with the CAO.
Mr. Blumenfield.
About the LexisNexis, the $334,000 request. I know the Office of Finance is also making a request. City Attorney is also making a request. Have we looked into the potential of, grouping these licenses, much as we've done with some other licenses recently, to save money overall?
We can do that. We can look into it and see whether or not we can have a single city contract that we can all piggyback off of.
Because that would be great not only for those departments, but all the other ones that might have a 1 or 2 time use for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. That's it. Attrition is very slightly less than what was budgeted. I think three positions, this indicates. But we are reflecting a small surplus both in sworn salaries and overtime.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like incongruous results to me. I would think that with less attrition, you'd have more deficit. But anyway, it's good. It's good that we have surplus there. I'm just wondering, with regard to overtime in particular, what I constantly am hearing from my captains is how much of a difficult management position they're in because of the restrictions on overtime. Can you just kind of give a little overview of where we are with regard to overtime and paying it down? And
Well, right now, it's an MOU issue at this point. Now, I'm thinking maybe the CAO may want to respond to that question rather than us, whether there is money in the UB.
Well, and as long as you're doing that, then, Mr. Santana, in relation to that, I'm also wondering what the thought process is in the recommendation of transferring money from the overtime general account to the salaries general account and salaries as needed account, given the ongoing challenges that we're having with overtime.
Excuse me, that's civilian overtime, not sworn. The general salary, overtime general is out of the civilian, not sworn.
Okay. I think that sufficiently answers then.
Okay.
Did you want to add anything else about the status of sworn overtime?
Yeah, just as part of some of our efforts to address our shortfalls from previous years and this year, we established in our MOU a significant reduction in cash overtime. There was a time that we used to pay up to $100 million of cash overtime. Now it's approximately, 15 to 20, if that?
Most of it is the reimbursable, like for LAX and our MOUs and stuff. I think our general fund overtime is about $4 or $5 million.
So it's obviously significantly reduced. What has been done in exchange is that we've been banking time, as you well know. Our ability to bank it at the levels that we're doing today will be ended at the end of the fiscal year. This is one piece of the MOU that expires on June 30th. And so when we start working on next year's budget, we have to be mindful of that. And there's three different elements to consider. One is, do we want to get back to $100 million of cash overtime? Obviously, that would be a significant impact on our projected deficits, and it's one of the variables that we laid out in the various scenarios for next year and the following years. The second is, what do you do with the amount of bank time that has currently been developed over the last few years? If you pay it off today, it's cheaper than if you wait till someone retires because it's based on their last salary. So there should be some consideration, as we've done this year, to start paying it down, and I think we put aside $20 million for that purpose. If we had to write a check to everybody today, it would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. So obviously the concern that you're hearing from your captains is the need to go back to some more reasonable level of what cash overtime should be. And in preparation of the budget, we'll be working with the chief and his team to establish what that amount should be. So being mindful of those three different issues is going to require some effective planning, of course. Related to all that is the other side of the argument in terms of the size of the workforce itself. And there's a tipping point where it's cheaper to hire versus cheaper to do overtime, or the other way around. And so figuring that out is going to be part of our assessment as we prepare the budget.
And in terms of filling the openings that we have with new officers and filling the entering classes, how has the response been since we've changed some of the terms of employment for incoming officers? How has that impacted your ability to hire?
My understanding is that it's had a significant impact on our ability to recruit officers because of the lower pay that they receive, the newer classes coming in, and it's affecting our ability to recruit now that other departments are now hiring. We're competing against the Sheriff's Department and other agencies.
That's also an MOU issue.
Yeah. Sorry.
With regard to the banked overtime issue that you mentioned, Mr. Santana, it clearly is more expensive because salaries continue to increase and you pay it at the higher salary. But when you are projecting out-year deficits, how do you determine what allocation to give for that payout in a given future budget year.
So I believe, and Ben, if you could help me recall this, I think what we did is we assumed that the amount that we're paying down this year continues in outgoing years, and that the amount of cash over time hovers at about $40 million. Do we approximate?
What we've assumed in the forecast in one scenario is, and which includes our current fiscal year, is we've set aside $15 million to help pay down that bank overtime amount for this current fiscal year, and that's been set aside on the UB. In one scenario, that $15 million is assumed to continue as an ongoing expenditure to help us, again, buy down on that banked overtime. In a second scenario, and that's a scenario where we show our deficit being at $242 million for next fiscal year, the buy down is actually an additional, on top of the 15, an additional $45 million for a total of $60 million. So there's obviously a significant increase. It's an assumption we've made. Under one scenario, we actually have that $15 million set aside for next fiscal year. If we go with the higher scenario, obviously that increases our structural or our deficit.
Follow up on that?
Yeah, Mr. Blumenfield.
I'm trying to understand the value of the banked. If it were a loan, let's say, and you took that money and called it a $100 million loan, what would the interest rate be?
It would be the interest of whatever COLAs and promotions that take place year after year after year. So, we're projecting also in the forecast that we don't provide any salary adjustments for 3 years for all city staff. And so at that point, the increases would be based on promotions that individuals receive.
You're asking if it's literally a loan, if we were to borrow the money to pay it down.
I'm trying to understand it in terms of the value, and I understand there are a lot of assumptions on it, what the increase in compensation is, when people retire, and I get that, but I would imagine you could do a calculation to sort of figure out what it would be based on the assumptions that you're making that would give us a sense of sort of what rate of interest we're really paying on this loan, so to speak.
If we were borrowing that amount, it would be cheaper if we borrowed it. And, we would get a much more effective interest rate than even if we have a relatively younger.
And if that's true, then why don't we borrow it? And pay it off and do it. Refinance, so to speak.
As we think about some of our liabilities, so this is potentially a one-time liability if you just pay it all off. It could be looked at that way, as well as other liabilities that we have resolving a settlement. Something worth considering in the context of all other options. Now, one of the things that it's important to point out is that the department has actually done a really good job of controlling overtime overall, even under this scenario. So while the banked overtime continues to grow, it's not growing at the same rate as in the use of overtime as it did prior to this all being done. So part of the efforts will also be to maintain a control of overtime as a tool in itself versus the way it was. So we'll be happy to come back sooner than the budget, probably in the mid-year, with a more comprehensive solution that could also include somehow taking a one-time source of revenue, whether it's a loan or looking at other funds to buy it off altogether.
It could even make sense. You take this one and a bunch of other similar kinds of things. We've done this in the state before. And then float a revenue bond to, where you get the lower interest rate and take care of it that way.
Right.
Sort of.
And that was part of the thinking in terms of buying it down. Why we recommended putting aside $15 million to buy it down, and we would recommend at minimum continuing that practice until we finally eliminate it, so that it goes down over a period of time. And I can't remember the threshold, but we did establish a threshold to buy it down to a particular number, and so that no one officer had more than X amount. So, but certainly as part of the mid-year report, we we do an annual report every year, comes out about January, February, that lays out a number of these sort of more complicated issues and lays out our best thinking about how to start tackling them one by one, and that would be certainly one of the specific areas that we'll give advice on.
It certainly seems like there could be
It's complicated.
Yeah, I think.
It's complicated, but there could be a compelling.
But I think you make a good point about using a combination of buying it down, maintaining control of it in the future, as well as what is the right number for cash overtime. Is it $4 million? Probably not. Is it $100 million? I would hope not. So where is the sweet spot in terms of the right amount?
I think one thing to consider as opposed to a loan where you're going to be paying everything back in cash, there's an opportunity with the bank to actually pay it back in time off. So that's the one consideration that we're at the time that this option was put in place, we were not necessarily cash rich, and our reserve fund was not at the point where it is today. So it was definitely a viable option to put in place for the time being. Now it is a time, as you say, to start looking at other options. There are some limitations we have here in the city that where the state doesn't, in terms of financing opportunities, if you will. And that's something that we will consider as we look at different options.
One last thing, I think, for you, Mr. Santana, that one of the recommendations is to reapprove $10 million in MICLA financing for vehicle purchases. Why do we need to reapprove that? Isn't that already? Why does that need to be redone?
Actually, that is the, Maria Gutierrez with the CAO's office, that is the MICLA policy. All items that have been approved in the budget require a reapproval. So you're going to see each fiscal year.
Until it's completely implemented.
So essentially a validation of a prior action.
Okay. And where do we stand in terms of implementing that purchase of the 276 vehicles?
Where do we stand on the purchase of the 270?
Of the non-patrol vehicles.
I'll have to get back to you on that, where we are.
Great. Thank you very much. That brings us to the Bureau of Engineering. Good afternoon. Mr. Blumenfield.
Like this one also, it's another example. We have surplus, which is great. We have surplus, but then it comes back to it's a direct constituent service issue. So I kind of want to raise the question: what do we need to be doing to make sure that we're maximizing the services out there, so that if I thought all the services were being done, we all know that we're well behind. So that's incongruous with the surplus issue. So what is it that we need to be doing to make sure that you get positions hired and that you are maximizing the services rather than having a surplus?
Correct. Alma Gibson with the CAO's office.
We don't see someone from engineering here, so Alma.
I could go ahead and speak as to what the surplus amount is, and again, it's $4.1 million that the Bureau is currently generating in terms of special fund surplus, and this is due to the 65 special funded vacancies as of August 2013 within the Bureau. However, the Bureau of Engineering has received, as of the beginning of this fiscal year, a blanket authority to hire from 115 classifications to assist with their succession workforce planning. To date, they've requested or they've received an unfreeze approval for 18 positions, and they're in the process of hiring these positions. It's my understanding that they are hoping to have these positions filled by January of this fiscal year. And this is, again, for some critical engineering positions that they need to backfill. The Bureau of Engineering has also indicated to me that they will be exploring other alternatives in order to meet any urgent and necessary demands, such as going to their on-call consultant lists. And at this point, they haven't indicated that they have, in fact, experienced any critical service interruptions for their services. So they're working on it. They're going to hire. They have authority to hire, and it's just a matter of time.
But it seems to be taking longer than I would expect, but I'm new at this, so I don't know. But you're saying it's not taking longer than it's expected, they're on target?
Well, the hiring process does take a while. I understand they're having to go through the whole hiring or interviewing. They're interviewing on campus, I believe, right now for some civil engineering associate positions, and that whole personnel process is a little bit, being delayed, I guess, in getting it done. But they hope, again, to fill these positions by January, and their ultimate goal is to fill up to 20 positions, they said, of engineering positions that they feel are critical to their services.
It
by
takes
the end of
about
the year.
6 months to hire in the city, approximately. Once the budget's approved, and then the process that departments go through. And in this case, they received a fairly significant approval from managed hiring to move aggressively, and so most hiring actually takes place in the second half of the fiscal year.
Correct.
Thank you. That brings us to the Bureau of Sanitation. Mr. Blumenfield?
You can probably guess my first question. I've asked it of several of the direct constituent service departments that are experiencing a surplus, which is, it's not the good savings, it's kind of the bad savings, because it directly impacts our constituents. So what do you need? What is there a slowdown in hiring the folks that you need to? And if so, what needs to be done about that?
Denise Plato, Bureau of Sanitation, Financial Management Division. Yes, we are experiencing challenges with getting our positions filled. Well, we experience challenges with getting the positions unfrozen and then getting them filled, and then getting people in place. So anything that can be done to expedite those processes would certainly improve our working environment and our ability to provide services.
But there's any particular red flags that you want to throw out there that we should be aware of?
You mean as far as pending?
As far as the obstacles to, I'm looking at all the departments of the surplus areas, which are the same areas where my constituents are complaining about not getting services, and I'm trying to, bring those two opposite ideas together. It's incongruous. So you're saying, well, there's some difficulties. I'm saying, well, specifically, what are they? What can we do? I sort of want to hear if there's something that the council needs to do to help make that happen, or if there's a stumbling block. It's just a matter of maybe it's just a matter of the positions have been unfrozen and it takes longer than I would imagine, and we're on track. And I'm just trying to make sure that we are indeed on track.
The only thing that I can think of specifically that we've managed to get unfreezes, and we're working on getting many of our actual field positions filled, which are the drivers, the collection workers, the wastewater treatment folks. We're working on getting those positions filled. The challenge right now in many cases has to do with our support positions in our administration and finance positions. Our support folks are really underwater right now. Things are getting dropped. We're having difficulty getting contracts through. Having difficulty getting positioned, getting people, even once we get the unfreeze from the CAO, we have limited staff, support staff and personnel and administration to actually get things moving and get people into the office, even outside of the personnel department, just coming into our own department. Our staff is so stretched that, how do you orient everybody? How do you process payroll for everybody? How do you get all of that paperwork and all of those things in order when you're operating at a 16% vacancy rate? It's very difficult. We have some very dedicated folks. We're relying very substantially on our overtime and as-needed salaries. As you can see, we've asked for additional transfers this year. But those are the challenges that we're facing.
Okay. Do you need loaner staff from other departments to get you up and running? What do you need? get through those challenges?
We need the ability to fill our positions.
You need what?
The ability to fill our positions. In some cases, that's the ability to get existing lists of eligibles. In some cases, that's getting unfreezes. In some cases, that's getting classification studies resolved so that we can move forward in filling positions.
Okay, I guess it's sort of the, what's the movie, Help Me, Help You.
Jerry Maguire.
Jerry Maguire, thank you. So help me, help you. Maybe you can give us a list of sort of those particulars. You mentioned a number of things, but get us those lists. These are services we want to. Sanitation does extremely important work. You do great work. Our constituents want you to do more of it.
Councilman, if I could just interject for a minute. Bureau of Sanitation has received, among most departments, probably the most unfettered access to exemptions from managed hiring as has been granted. So I don't think it's necessarily the unfreeze process anymore. You have to imagine that we were going through a period of downsizing, and where the work that personnel does, for example, on examinations and things of that nature, really was non-existent. Now that we're coming out of it, and now that we're, in essence, at a time of exploring hiring, personnel and other functions across the city need to kind of get back to speed to where they once were, and they're not there yet. So it's not just a matter of one process. It's probably multiple processes in the city that have, because of the downturn, weren't being addressed, and now that there is funding, and especially special fund departments, that probably needs to be addressed now as well.
I get that, and I'm just trying to sort of, and I appreciate that very much. Just trying to sort of hone in on the tangible things so that we can.
Yeah. And one of the things that we could do, in the context of the mid-year report, is provide sort of a new thinking on the managed hiring process in terms of how it was established. I know everyone hates managed hiring, and I have to go through managed hiring myself when I hire for my office. But it has been a significant part of saving the city. It has prevented us. It has allowed us to survive these very difficult times with very few layoffs, and I think that was a priority for the mayor and the council. And so the question is, does that model still exist as we move forward? And I would argue some variation of that certainly does. So at least in terms of the first step is getting the budget and the positions authorized, making sure that they're appropriate positions. The second, once the budget's approved and we begin the fiscal year, departments submit a plan to manage hiring. They submit a global plan in terms of this is what we're looking for, that's what we urge. Managed hiring tends to give preference to field positions that are providing direct services to your constituents instead of administrative positions. And then once that's granted, then the whole hiring process begins, and that's been indicated. That process is a little rusty because we haven't been hiring as aggressively over the last few years, and so part of the analysis will include what will be necessary to bring it up to speed. It wasn't that, it was just a year ago that we were trying to identify where to house people. So, before we brought in someone new from the outside, we wanted to make sure that we preserved a job for someone already working for the city to avoid a layoff. So that was really a big part of the focus. And some of that is still occurring, but not to the same extent. So it is, I think you raised a lot of good questions about how to help departments find the right size to the level where the services are still being granted, and how to facilitate that process. And not every department's the same. Sanitation's a department that is primarily funded through special funds versus the police department, which primarily is general fund, and the general fund is still in projected deficit. So that'll be one of the areas that we come back and we'll work with the CLA and the mayor's office who sit on managed hiring on that process.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to what Ben and Miguel just said. Wilson Poon at the CAO's office. The last 2 years, the Bureau did receive a blanket exemption from managed hiring. This year, they received, I think, all but 300 positions were exempt, and those were, as Denise said, mostly administrative positions. I think some of the challenges come and just filling the positions directly. You know, I think sanitation definitely gets. They do a great job training their employees in operating heavy-duty equipment and, you know, commercial vehicles, and they make them prime targets for DWP and other proprietary departments. At the same time, I think whenever you have someone at the top retire, it takes about 3 different types of steps to backfill that, you know, position. If a refuse collection supervisor leaves, you have to promote a refuse truck operator, to promote a maintenance laborer. So for every person that leaves, there's quite a long process to kind of actually backfill the position. And I think some of those have presented challenges for the Bureau to kind of you know, overcome attrition. The hiring rate is just not catching up with attrition. So they do have a blanket exemption for the last 2 years, and they have been doing their best and hardest to fill those positions. But I think that's the reality here.
Another area of questioning, if I may, Mr. Chair, the impact of the sunset of Prop O and how it's going to impact core operations. I wanted to ask about that in particular.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last.
The impact of the sunset on Proposition O.
Yes.
And how and if it will impact core operations.
Well, Prop O itself is intended to actually design and construct the projects. So as long as they don't break down, there shouldn't be a problem. The stormwater program is facing lots of challenges. We were trying to partner with the county, but that effort has somewhat been fallen apart. I'm not quite sure or in a position to be able to discuss the current status of Prop O. The Bureau of Sanitation works with the Bureau of Engineering, who is responsible for the Prop O fund and administration of that fund and managing that fund.
You know, since you raised Prop O, I know a number of the approved projects either are not going forward or are coming in under budget, and there will be some additional funds that may become available for reappropriation within Prop O. When do you think, and if you're not prepared to say that now, we can get a report back, but I have a few ideas, and I'm kind of continuing to wait to see when we're going to know whether there's additional money there that can be used.
I think the Bureau of Engineering is the entity that's in the best position to be able to respond to the Prop O program overall.
Okay. Well, we'll leave that for another time.
We're currently preparing a report on that.
Oh, excellent. Okay, very good. Just, Mr. Blumenfield, since you've raised the point a few times absolutely correctly about as these surpluses come up, it's right for us to think about service restoration. It's also important to keep it in the context, though, that although the demand for services throughout departments has vastly increased, one of the principal ways that the city erased $1 billion in projected deficit was by reducing the size of the workforce to the smallest that it's been since Tom Bradley was mayor. And the way we've done that is not really through layoffs, but it's been through constrained hiring and attrition. And so we survived this crisis, and the ship is still afloat primarily, or in large measure, because of that exact reduction. That being said, now that the storm is starting to pass, it is absolutely appropriate for us to start to think about how we start restoring some of those critical services that our constituents depend upon. But since you mentioned Jerry Maguire, just keep in mind there's another important line from that movie that this committee should always keep in mind as well. So as the FSRs move forward, we'll have an opportunity to continue that discussion as revenues come in. All right, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry, I did have one question. And actually this is more, I think, for the CAO. Since we're talking about vacancy rates, one of the areas that your report indicates that there is a very high rate, vacancy rate, is in the Clean Water and Solid Resources Program, and that may require general fund reimbursement back to the solid waste Resources Fund because of related cost reimbursements.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what I'm thinking is, while I get that that would have to be reimbursed if those positions aren't filled, if we are of a mind that we would like to reduce that vacancy rate and get those positions filled, then perhaps that might obviate the need for some of that reimbursement, and maybe we ought not to be rushing to do that reimbursement until we determine whether or not those positions are going to be refilled and therefore, reduce the requirement for reimbursement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Basically what happens is when we prepare the budget, we assume we use the salary dollars that we appropriate to determine what the related cost reimbursements will be to the general fund. Obviously, if there's high vacancies, that number is going to be significantly reduced. What the Bureau does at the close of every fiscal year is they determine how much was actually charged, how much was actually expended from those salary accounts, and they make this reconciliation, this adjustment. So we usually don't see it till the previous year after the year has been closed out.
Okay, so maybe that answers my question. This is a routine annual true-up that needs to be done. This is, okay, I thought this was a specific problem due to the high vacancy rate, but if we do it on an annual basis, probably no need to upset the apple cart then. So if there is additional hiring, then we'll just true it up again the following year based on whatever that reimbursement requirement is. Okay.
I'm sorry, I do need to interject.
Yeah.
The true-up does occur every year, but the amount of the true-up is dependent upon how many positions are actually filled. The amount that's indicated in the current report is from prior years. So filling our positions currently would have no impact on the prior year adjustments that still need to be made.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
So, which is why it's better to leave it as an annual process, I suppose.
Right, because we do it the following year.
Right, gotcha. Okay. All right, thanks very much. I think that brings me to the end of my list.
Councilmember, may I make a comment?
Yes, absolutely.
Office of Finance, we weren't called special, but we did want to just make a corrective comment into the record. In our section, it reported that we said we would meet all adopted revenue, and we basically said it was too early to assess whether we were going to meet our revenue at this point.
Let me get to my notes.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I just wanted to mention Jan Zatorsky, Office of Finance, that we just wanted to make a correction to the record that in our finance section, it was reported that we would meet all department revenue projections, and the actual report that we provided to the CAO's office was that it was too early to assess whether we would meet all of our revenues for this year.
Okay.
Although we're working very diligently to do
When
so.
When do you think you'll know?
In the next report,
Okay.
the next report that we'll make, we'll have a better assessment.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you. Any comment, Mr. Santana? Okay. All right. I think that there's nothing else. Mr. Santana, anything else?
No.
Did I miss
Karen
something?
Calfine with the CLA's office. We've provided just a couple of technical adjustments.
Oh, yes.
So I think the city clerk has distributed those to you, so we just ask that those be included in the report.
Thank you for the reminder. There's a written amendment that should be before you, Mr. Blumenfield, and that, without objection, that'll be included as part of the FSR as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anything else? Not bad. Hour and a half for an FSR. Pretty good. I don't think it's our record, but it's pretty good. All right, thank you very much. And that brings us, so since we don't have a quorum here, it will be the recommendation of the chair, at least, to, and Mr. Blumenfield, if you'll join me in approving the FSR as amended and advancing it to council.
And I do want to note that there is a placeholder for this item on council's agenda for Wednesday, the October 23rd.
Very good. Thank you very much. So I think that then brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3 is the State Administrative Officer report relative to rating agency reports regarding pension funding.
Mr. Santana, welcome back.
So item number 3 is essentially a report that shares with you 2 or 3 various reports that were produced by our bond rating agencies on our state of our pension and retiree health care program. 2 of them, specifically from Moody's and Fitch, comment on a recent decision or a draft of a decision in order granting a writ of mandate on litigation between the city and the City Attorneys Association on the issue of retiree health care. It would not be appropriate to get into the specifics of that case or the status of our current mediation with the city attorneys in public. I would recommend that be discussed in ERC or at council as part of labor negotiations. But we did want to highlight that the 2 reports that were issued were significant from the standpoint that it shares how closely the issue of retiree health care is being monitored, not just here in Los Angeles, but throughout the country. It is the city's position that retiree health care is not a vested right unless agreed upon through a 4% contribution made by the majority of our bargaining units. And what the case is about is challenging that notion. One of the reports in particular, we were concerned because it stated a number of inaccuracies, and I won't go into them in detail, but they're enumerated in our response to not only inform you, but as well as the public on the nature of the case and the impact. The most significant difference is in terms of the potential impact of this litigation is that both the plaintiff and the city agree that the outcome is much more limited than what the Fitch report discussed. The Fitch report gave implications that it would have precedent setting not just for us but throughout the state. We believe that it really only impacts those bargaining units that represent about 500 city employees. It doesn't even have an impact within the larger city itself. There was a second report also issued by Moody's that did an evaluation of the 50 largest U.S. local governments and the state of their pension funds. And they essentially recalculate, based on a different set of assumptions, the state of pensions throughout the country and looked at the status of various funds from the 50 largest cities. Under their scenario, they evaluate the city as having one of 5 highest liabilities, and put it in the category of other major cities. And the simplest way of discussing what the analysis did is essentially looked at our operating revenue and evaluated that over our overall liability. And our pensions aren't paid in 1 year. They're paid on an annual year. It's kind of like paying your mortgage on an annual year. So it's not necessarily the most accurate way of evaluating the state of health of our system. And so while it's an interesting way of looking at it, we feel that our system is doing better than what they projected it to be. Having said that, obviously, we've been working very hard to control our pension costs, adopting a new pension tier for sworn, for civilian, engaging in major reform in terms of retiree health care. We are one of the few cities in the country that actually pre-fund health care, so it's in a much healthier state. Most jurisdictions actually pay annually, so whatever the bill is that year, they pay it, and so it becomes a much more unpredictable liability versus what we do is we treat it much like our pensions where we put money aside every year and pre-fund that program. We've been doing that for decades, one of the strong things that the city does, and we recommend continue doing that. So as we move forward, our pension costs and retiree health care costs continue to grow. we project, based on the latest illustration provided by both systems, that the overall cost for pensions, and it's on page 4, by year 2016-17 will be 1.19 billion on the city side. It's important to note that we had projected about that same amount 3 years ago for the current year. So again, this is one of the solutions that we've adopted to try to control those costs. What drive those costs now that we've adopted new pension tiers, engaged in having most city employees contribute to retiree health care, there are the two factors that we can control around pensions is are how much we pay our employees. On the sworn side, as an example, next fiscal year, we're expected to have for every our pension costs on the sworn side to be about 50 to 52% of salary. So that means for every dollar of compensation we pay our employees, we'll have to find an additional 50 to 52 cents to cover pension costs. So obviously, as the workforce grows, as we provide raises, then that has an impact on our pension costs. The second is obviously the size of the workforce, and so is compensation. The third, we have less control over the stock market and how well the system does. We watch that carefully, but our ability to control that is fairly minimal. So our recommendation is that we continue to work with the ERC to control our pension costs, again, mainly now through compensation. We fully commit to the pension tiers that have been adopted, and continue to find ways to address the specific challenges around retiree health care. But with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Santana. We have one card on this matter. Mr. Mcquisten.
Jim McQuiston. Miguel pointed out to me some time ago about this matter and asked me to look at it. And I agree with what he had said, that the city does not use the general accepted accounting practices in the first place. And it takes you a while to get on to how it is. But they do follow the most important accounting practice, and that is you never change your accounting method. And that's really what counts. And I believe that when Moody's tries to go over all of the cities and use the same GAAP, it just doesn't work for the city of Los Angeles. And once you get into the fact that we're, I'd say, the stingiest penny pinchers of any city that I know, we always seem to come out with our feet on the ground rather than our heads on the ground. So as long as we have this kind of a workforce, we've got no problems at all. What we have to do is make sure that we don't figure that our workforce thinks that the city is going to double cross them. And that's, I think, the most important principle that we have to use. We have terrific employees, and if they got the idea that the city wasn't on their side, they could go elsewhere, and we would be in bad shape. So I have no problem at all. I think this Moody's report and the Fitch's report is just so much trash. Now, as you well know, people have said what the stock market is going to do over the years, and some people were right and some people were wrong. And the same thing is true of any evaluation system. So I would tend not to pay any attention to this at all. But I do think that we do not do ourselves good by sending out alarms that our pension system is bad and we have to fix it and this, that, and the other thing. I think that's the worst thing we can possibly do. So I do want to pass that on. I do want to say one other thing, though, and that is I told the fire chief if he wants to control his deficit, what he should do is cut down the number of heart attacks in the city.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. McQuisten. All right. So without objection, Mr. Blumenfield will note and file the CAO's report. And if we had a quorum, I would be proposing as consent candidates items 7 and 8. Since we don't, Mr. Blumenfield, it would be my recommendation to advance on the recommendation of chair and a member items 7 and 8. Without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Okay, so before we take that action, then we'll hear from Mr. Mcquisten. Go right ahead, sir.
Jim Mcquisten. I don't mind changing this at all because when you look at $2,500 maximum, it's just kind of ridiculous. However, I do think we should have had a maximum on it, maybe $50,000, because some nominal figure is always a good idea. I mean, if we throw away our basic computer system, somebody else might use $1 million computer system, and we do want to have some kind of control over what we do, and it does serve some kind of a principle in effect, but it's still a very large number, and it probably wouldn't affect any of our recent contributions to anybody.
All right. Thank you. So it will be the action of on recommendation of the chair and Mr. Blumenfield to approve items 7 and 8. And that brings us then to items 5 and 6, which we can take together.
Item number 5 is a motion, Bloomfield, Weston, LaBonge, England, relative to directing the city administrative officer with the assistance of the chief legislative analyst to report on the impacts to the city of failure by Congress to have a federal budget in place for the beginning of the federal fiscal year 2014, which begins on October 1st, and the resulting shutdown. And item number 6 is a motion, Krikorian Price et al., relative to requesting the chief legislative analyst to report with options to put on potential funding sources for senior meal programs to preserve the services that would be lost if the federal government shutdown continues.
All right. Since Mr. Blumenfield made one of these motions and I made the other, I don't think it requires a lot of discussion on our part, but I do want to just point out that these are not moot issues. Because while the immediate crisis in Washington has been averted for the moment, it will almost certainly loom itself again probably prior to the end of the year. So I do want to ask that we continue to move forward with these motions and get these reports and have our contingency plans in place for all of the impacts that an additional federal shutdown might have. My particular concern is with the senior meals programs because that was what was most endangered during the sequester, and we were able to fix that. But I certainly anticipate that we're going to see this again, and so I would rather be prepared than be reactive when it occurs. So, Mr. Bloomfield, do you want to?
Same thing. Just it may require either changing the wording or just the understanding that you made, because it says the impact of the federal government shutdown. So clearly, what we're referring to is not just what happened, but of a potential future government shutdown. So we're saying the same thing. I don't know if it requires any modification of the words, but maybe just that understanding.
I think that's a clear enough correction, and if we could ask to get those reports back, at maybe early in December, so that we'll be prepared in case December comes along and they still haven't resolved issues.
Okay.
All right, so that will be the action on recommendation of the chair and Mr. Blumenfield, and I believe that brings us to the conclusion of our open session items. And so that brings us then to item number 1, which we'll hear in closed session. And thank you all very much. By the way, is there any public comment on item number 1? Seeing none, comment on item number 1 is closed. Is there any general public comment? Seeing none, general public comment is closed. All right, that brings us to item number 1. And we are in closed session. Mr. Seha, do you need to report anything?
No.
Closed session. Okay. All right, we're back in open session, and Mr. Blumenfield, I actually would like to ask that we reconsider item number 3, the CAO's report on pensions. We noted and filed it, but the recommendation also in the report also included directing the city administrative officer to report to the EERC on additional strategies to control pension costs, and that instruction should be part of our recommendation as well. So if you have no objection, that will be the action of the committee. And with that, we are adjourned.
Chair?